The exam paper lands face down on the desk, and the score visible through the backlight already tells you it is not what you hoped for. Your stomach tightens before you even turn the paper over, and a familiar inner voice starts listing everything you should have done differently. You stayed up late, but studied the wrong chapter, skipped the review session, and now a single number seems to rewrite what you thought you knew about your own ability. That voice inside grows sharp. You were lazy. You let yourself down, and no reasonable person would go easy on themselves right now. Yet another quieter thought surfaces almost instantly, whispering that maybe the test was unfair. The questions were tricky, and it really is not your fault. And that feels like making excuses. You are caught between a harsh prosecutor who demands more punishment and a defender who wants to rewrite the story so you do not have to feel the weight of it. The prosecutor insists that without self-criticism, you will slide into complacency and never improve, while the defender seems to offer only an escape hatch from responsibility. Both voices leave you stuck. One floods you with shame, the other drains the meaning from the setback, and neither points clearly toward what you should actually do next. This is the knot that self-compassion must untangle, because the most important question is not whether you punish or pardon yourself, but how you move forward without lying to yourself. The ordinary instinct is to treat self-kindness the way you would treat a friend who let you down. You fear that soft words will only encourage more failure. Many people believe that self-criticism works like a strict coach, keeping standards high, while self-compassion sounds like the coach who cancels practice because everyone tried hard enough. That split seems clean until you notice what actually happens inside the person who relies on self-criticism as their main engine of motivation. Self-criticism after a mistake often triggers a cascade that begins with shame, moves quickly into avoidance, and ends with the mind doing almost anything to escape the bad feeling. The harsh inner voice, therefore, does not automatically produce harder work. It frequently produces a quiet retreat from the very task that needs attention. Self-compassion, in contrast, begins with a completely different first move. Instead of running from the discomfort, you pause and acknowledge plainly that this hurts and you wish it had gone differently. That pause is not an excuse because it does not rewrite the facts. It simply refuses to add a layer of self-contempt on top of the disappointment. The distinction matters more than it first appears, because an excuse changes the story of what happened, while self-compassion changes the emotional climate in which you examine what happened. Saying, "the test was impossible," alters the cause and removes your agency, but saying, "this feels awful, and I made mistakes I want to understand," keeps the facts intact while softening the blow enough to look again. One of the most replicated findings in this area is that people who score high on self-compassion are actually more likely to take personal responsibility for their errors, not less. That can sound backward until you consider the logic. It is easier to admit a mistake fully when you know that admission will not be met with a flurry of insults from inside your own head. If every confession of a shortcoming triggers an attack, the mind learns to protect itself by shifting blame outward to safer targets: the teacher, the timing, the luck. Excuses often grow in soil rich with self-punishment because the psyche will do what it must to survive an unbearable sense of failure. Self-compassion removes that survival pressure, allowing you to say a clean and complete, "I messed up," without the unspoken fear that you will now be emotionally demolished. This is why researchers distinguish self-compassion sharply from self-indulgence. Indulgence lets you off the hook, but compassion keeps you on the hook while making the hook bearable. Imagine holding a hot pan with your bare hands. The natural response is to drop it immediately, and in that reflexive release, you lose the ability to examine the pan or carry it somewhere useful. Harsh self-judgment is like increasing the heat until you drop the responsibility, while self-compassion is like handing yourself a pair of oven mitts so you can hold the difficult situation long enough to do something about it. The mitts do not claim the pan is not hot, and they do not pretend you never dropped it before. They simply give you the capacity to stay in contact with the truth without getting burned. This capacity changes what happens next, because once you can tolerate the discomfort of a mistake, you can ask the practical questions that lead to real repair. What exactly went wrong, and what needs to change? A student who practices self-compassion after a bad grade might say something like, "I am disappointed, and I also know that I rushed through the last chapters. I need to review those and ask for help early next time." Notice that the statement contains no self-flagellation and no external alibi. It holds the pain and the plan in the same breath, and that is the signature of accountability without cruelty. The first explanation, that being kind to yourself is just letting yourself off easy, breaks down as soon as you see that self-compassion actually requires more honest contact with the mistake, not less. Underneath this difference sits a set of 3 components that researchers have identified as the active ingredients of self-compassion: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Each component matters on its own, but together they form a structure that naturally separates compassion from excuse-making, much like the legs of a stool that cannot stand on one alone. Self-kindness is the warm tone you use when you speak to yourself about the failure, the choice to use words like "you struggled" rather than "you are pathetic," and that tone is not cosmetic. Tone changes what the brain expects next. A kind tone signals safety, and safety is the condition under which learning systems in the mind become most receptive to new information. Crucially, self-kindness does not say the error was acceptable. It says the person who made the error is still worthy of care while they face what they did. Common humanity is the recognition that making mistakes is part of being human, not a special sign that you are uniquely broken or permanently below everyone else. Without this piece, self-kindness can feel shallow because the suffering still carries a sense of isolation. I am being gentle with myself, but I am the only one who failed this test while everyone else got it. Excuses can also hijack this element, turning common humanity into "everyone fails, so my failure does not matter," which waters down the significance of the event. Self-compassion uses common humanity differently, not to diminish the mistake, but to remove the shameful uniqueness. Others have been here, and I am not alone in this struggle, so I do not need to hide. Mindfulness is the third piece, and it is the one that most directly prevents the slide into excuse-making because it trains you to see what actually occurred without exaggerating or minimizing. When the thought, "I will never be good at this," appears, mindfulness helps you see it as a thought passing through, not as a final verdict, and that space allows you to check it against reality. A person caught in excuses might say, "It did not matter anyway," while mindful self-compassion notices the urge to dismiss and gently returns to the fact that it did matter to you. These 3 components together explain why self-compassion correlates with higher motivation to correct errors, not because people become soft, but because they gain the emotional stability required to face difficult feedback. Evidence from multiple studies shows that self-compassionate individuals procrastinate less after a setback, set more specific improvement goals, and engage in more deliberate practice following failure. These are not the patterns of someone who lets themselves off the hook. They are the patterns of someone who has learned to metabolize disappointment without being poisoned by it. One of the most clarifying contrasts appears when you look at what happens in the hours and days after a significant personal failure, when the mind replays the event over and over. If the replay is dominated by harsh self-criticism, It tends to loop on the worst moments, the exact point the mistake became visible, without moving toward a resolution, like a video stuck on the crash frame. Self-compassionate replay, by comparison, walks through the sequence with the intention to understand. Here is where I got confused. Here is where I could have paused. And here is what I can do differently. The difference is not that the compassionate replay is less painful, but that the pain is joined by curiosity rather than condemnation, and curiosity opens doors that condemnation locks. An excuse, by contrast, stops the replay entirely, replacing it with a static label, bad test, or unfair grader, that prevents any new learning from the experience. So the three roads after failure are now visible. One leads into a swamp of self-attack, where you sink deeper into avoidance. One leads to a wall of excuses where you go nowhere. And one leads uphill through honest discomfort toward a clearer view. Self-compassion is that uphill path, and the effort required is real, because you are climbing with the full weight of the mistake, not dropping it by the roadside. This explains why people sometimes resist self-compassion even when they understand it. It asks them to stay with the feeling of failure longer than either self-criticism or excuse-making permits. Self-criticism, for all its pain, offers a quick escape through fantasy. You imagine that if you just punish yourself enough now, you will never fail again, and that fantasy feels like control. Excuses offer a different escape by rewriting the record, but self-compassion offers no escape. It offers presence, which is harder and more honest. Yet, it is precisely that presence that allows real change. Because you can only adjust what you can look at steadily, and you can only look steadily at something when you are not bracing for a blow. So the mechanism under pressure reveals a profound reversal. The part of you that seems hardest on yourself is often the part that is most afraid, and the part that seems softest is actually the one strong enough to face the whole truth. Now return to that moment with the exam paper still face down on the desk, and notice how the meaning of the scene has already begun to shift. The harsh prosecutor is no longer the voice of high standards. It is a voice that fears you cannot handle disappointment and tries to preempt future failure through pain. The defender that offered excuses was not protecting your growth. It was protecting you from the prosecutor, running from the same fear in the opposite direction. Neither voice truly trusted you to sit with the mistake, learn from it, and try again with more intelligence and more kindness. That lack of trust is the hidden engine driving both extremes, because when you believe you are fundamentally incapable of bearing failure, the only options look like attack or escape. Self-compassion introduces a third option that requires a different belief: that you are capable of holding your own pain without being destroyed by it, and that you can learn without being shamed into it. In everyday life, this distinction shows up most clearly around accountability, because accountability is the act of owning your contribution to an outcome without letting the outcome define your entire self. A student who practices self-compassion can walk into a teacher's office and say, "I was underprepared and I want to understand the material better," without needing to cry, deflect, or grovel. That sentence is not an excuse because it does not explain away the failure. It locates the cause squarely in the person's own preparation, and it also implies a forward movement. Excuses, in contrast, would place the cause outside. The review session did not cover this, or everyone found it hard, none of which gives the teacher anything to work with, or the student any grip on improvement. Self-compassion thus creates the conditions for genuine accountability, while excuse-making undermines accountability by severing the link between your choices and your results. This is why therapists and educators increasingly teach self-compassion skills alongside study strategies and communication tools, because without the emotional foundation, The practical techniques often collapse under stress. When a student knows how to organize their notes, but cannot tolerate the feeling of getting a question wrong, the study plan becomes a trigger for avoidance rather than a path to mastery. When they know how to apologize, but cannot face the shame of having hurt someone, the apology becomes a performance rather than a sincere attempt to reconnect. Self-compassion, therefore, is not a supplement to competence. It is the soil in which competence can grow without being regularly trampled by fear. And here the deepest reversal arrives, the one that most people do not see coming. Self-compassion actually raises your standards because it refuses to settle for the low bar of feeling better quickly. Self-criticism sets an impossible standard that collapses into avoidance, and excuse-making sets no standard at all by denying that a standard was missed. Self-compassion sets a high standard to face the mistake, feel the full cost of it, take responsibility for your part, and actively repair whatever can be repaired. That is a far more demanding path than either shattering yourself with blame or papering over the crack with an excuse, and it requires more emotional maturity, not less. The student who practices self-compassion ends up working harder because they are now working to close a gap they can see clearly, rather than working to silence an inner tormentor. Their motivation shifts from fear of punishment to desire for growth, and that shift is one of the most powerful changes documented in the psychology of learning and persistence. So, the central dramatic question, how can you be kind to yourself without letting yourself off the hook, resolves into a practical insight. The kindest thing you can do is hold yourself to a standard that includes honesty, care, and action. That transformation does not happen overnight, and even people who understand it will sometimes hear the old prosecutor or the old defender pipe up in moments of stress, because the habits of self-relation run deep. But the knowledge that a third way exists changes how you hear those voices, because now they are not the only authorities in the room. You can notice the critical thought and say, I hear your fear, but I do not need to be attacked right now to understand what I did. And you can notice the excusing thought and say, I hear your wish to protect me, but I need to stay with the truth. After the climax of this understanding, what remains is the quieter work of practice, the daily choice to pause before piling on blame or reaching for a too easy explanation. One concrete option researchers have tested is writing a brief letter to yourself in the voice of a compassionate witness. Someone who sees what you did, neither sugarcoating nor condemning, and who asks what you need to learn and do now. The letter is not a diary entry to be forgotten. It is a rehearsal of a new inner voice, and with repetition, that voice can become more automatic than the old ones. Another option is to check your self-talk for the presence of common humanity by asking quietly, would I say this to a friend I respected? And if the answer is no, what exactly am I adding that is not truthful or helpful? These practices are not about letting yourself off. They are about holding on to yourself while you walk through the difficult territory of growth, much like keeping a hand on a railing while climbing uneven steps. Return now one final time to the exam paper on the desk, its score still unchanged, because the past cannot be rewritten even by compassion. But the person who picks it up now can be different, can carry the disappointment without turning it into self-contempt, can acknowledge the gap without pretending it does not matter. That person can call a friend and say, I did badly, and I know why, and I am not okay, but I am not broken. And the friend will sense the difference between a plea for rescue and a statement of embodied responsibility. The paper does not vanish. It becomes a marker of a specific moment that holds information rather than a tribunal that issues a permanent sentence. Self-compassion does not erase the evidence. It reframes the case so that the outcome is not about worthlessness, but about the next action that can be taken with a mind that is clear instead of clouded by shame. And that is the ultimate distinction from making excuses, because an excuse wants to make the evidence disappear, while self-compassion wants to make the evidence useful. In the end, the voice that says, "You can face this and you deserve support while you do," is not a voice of weakness. It is the voice of someone who has finally understood that accountability is not the opposite of kindness. It is its completion. So the next time your own exam paper, your own mistake, lands heavy in front of you, you might notice the old impulse to attack or excuse. Pause just long enough to feel both the disappointment and your own steady presence, and then begin again.